The Mask. This one was requested by a friend who didn't think I could fix it. He's wrong. The Mask is not a story, but it's actually closer than anything else we've seen so far. Like Raiders of the Lost Ark, this movie actually does a good job establishing its hero. The fixes that need doing here mostly involve removing Peggy as a character, because she's not only useless in this film, but actively makes it less of a story. There are some other small fixes in Act 1, and otherwise it's the revisions of some scenes where the correct characters replace or omit Peggy. I'm also taking out the Ben Stein character because his scenes distract and confuse Stanley's narrative. Ultimately, what we'll end up with is just a stronger, funnier, more impactful, and actually complete story for The Mask, which will also make quality sequels more viable. Act 1. We open with the mask scene underwater, but here in the fixed version, instead of it already being sunken treasure that gets disturbed, it's in a box that falls off a ship into the bay, from a shipment to the museum for its new mask exhibit. The box breaks open underwater when something that fell after it hits it, and the mask floats up as in the film. Show title credits. Stanley works at a bank, and here we have to make a small fix to how the following scene plays out. In a fixed version, this scene instead shows the girl he works with thanking him for giving her the tickets to go to the mask exhibit at the museum last night with her friend. She says, I know we were supposed to go, but thanks for letting me take my friend Stanley. And then she kind of explains, or they have that scene there, you really are the nicest guy, isn't he, Charlie? And then Charlie says his line or whatever. And then she says, oh, by the way, did you hear? They apparently lost one of the ancient Norse masks in the shipment, the Mask of Loki. Stanley replies, the Mask of Loki? The one the Norse god of mischief was supposedly sealed into when Odin banished him from Valhalla? And the girl replies, wow, you really did learn all that mythology. Well, anyway, thanks again, Stanley. See you later. Then we get Stanley's line with Charlie, I think I'm wearing her down. Now that scene really sells that line, and we have the mask set up properly. Charlie invites Stanley for a night out on the town, and then the rest of the scene plays out the same as in the film, with Stanley and Charlie meeting Tina, in the bank, and Tina recording the bank for Dorian with her purse camera. The story can continue playing out the same as in the film for a little more, with Stanley getting thrown into the gutter at the Coco Bongo Club, Tina seeing the loaner car, and Stanley finding the mask in the bay after the loaner car breaks down on the bridge. And that's Act 1 fixed. Not too much, but those few minor fixes both improve the nice guy narrative and also properly set up the mask device. Act 2. Here the film can play out mostly as is, but with a minor change at the start. Stanley gets home and gets yelled at for the volume on his cartoons, but instead of switching to the Ben Stein interview, he just turns off the TV and then realizes Milo is growling at the mask. Stanley takes the mask and, standing in front of the mirror, pretends to be presenting it like he's conducting a museum tour, and maybe then he comments something like, a lot of good that did, referring to learning all the exhibit mythology in anticipation of his canceled date. Then, as a joke, Stanley puts on the mask, and the rest of the scene plays out as in the film. Stanley, as the mask, scares Mrs. Peenman, then goes out and terrorizes the street gang, and finally sodomizes two shady mechanics with exhaust pipes who scammed him on his car repairs. Stanley wakes up the next morning and gets the knock from Lieutenant Kellaway, which plays out the same. Stanley is late for work, and the beginning of the work scene is the same, with Stanley and Charlie talking to the bank manager. Since there's no Peggy in this fixed story, though, what happens next is it's now Lieutenant Kellaway who enters the bank and questions Stanley for the second time this morning, this time about being a client of the attacked mechanics. This scene now plays out with the comedy the original film lacks. Here, Stanley's evasiveness answering the lieutenant's questions just gets funnier and funnier, having just been questioned by him earlier at home in his pajamas. Whereas in the film, this scene where he's meeting Peggy for the first time clashes with the entire tone and narrative the film presents to us. It's not funny and confusingly presents Peggy as a potential romantic interest to a guy who both couldn't even get a date before, but is also now interested in Tina. At best, this scene in the film is trying to contrast Peggy and Tina, but that would suggest Stanley needs to be a nice guy, i.e. himself, to get Peggy, but would have to change to get Tina. This is not only disproved by the film itself, because Tina does love Stanley for who he is and never rejects him, but the entire plot is pushing Tina towards Stanley anyway, so Peggy never had a chance. She's basically the exact same as Tina, but single and a redhead, except apparently she's not trustworthy. She's completely redundant as a character. In all 5 scenes she appears in, 3 of which are less than a minute long, and 2 of those don't have Stanley in them. Next scene is Nico terrorizing Dorian. This can stay as is. Now we get to Stanley, who tosses and turns in his bed as he dreams about Tina, and is then woken up by his dog Milo licking his face. Stanley gets up and grabs the newspaper clipping of Tina from his mirror. He's insecure and doesn't think Tina will be interested in him, so he considers using the mask again. In the film, he only briefly hesitates, and it doesn't seem like much of a dilemma to the audience. There's just no stakes here. In the fixed version, this is the night after Stanley just spent a day working with his boss, who was mad at him for being late, and a police lieutenant questioned him twice in the same day about crimes he definitely did commit on just his first night out as the Mask. And Lieutenant Kellaway doesn't even know about the attempted murder of the street gang when Stanley shot at them with his conjured Tommy gun, or the property damage and potential assault charges from blowing out the honking guy's windows with a tactical air horn. That guy may very well be deaf, considering the sodomized mechanics needed a proctologist. The stakes are way higher here now. Stanley may want Tina, but is using the mask again worth the risk after all that? Well, Stanley decides yes, Tina is worth it. Tina is so worth it, in fact, that Stanley decides to rob his own bank, comedically just ahead of Dorian's crew, who is just about to rob the same bank. Here, though, when Stanley bursts out of the doors with the money bags over his shoulders and flexes on Dorian's crew before bolting off with the money, it's a much more dramatic scene with Stanley's more questionable motive. Now, Stanley is becoming a flawed hero who will need to be redeemed, and that's interesting. The scene that plays out in the movie, though, is just Stanley has no dilemma to put on the mask again, and when he bursts out of the bank with the robbers there, it just kind of gets a weird chuckle. There's no impact with the scene in the film, but now I've fixed it. The next scene can play out the same. Stanley dances with Tina, Dorian gets mad and starts shooting, the mask gets away, and Dorian is caught by Kellaway and his men. Kellaway finds a piece of Stanley's pajamas that transformed back from a piece of clothing Dorian or his henchmen shot off. Stanley is questioned again by Kellaway, but again evades his questions, and this is the next morning. So Kellaway shows him the pajamas, and Stanley, I think, says that those pajamas were stolen. When Kellaway gets back to the station, though, Stanley is his prime suspect, and that is in the film. Next scene plays out the same, with Dorian putting a bounty out on the mask and having an argument with Tina over dancing with the mask. Same as in the movie, Stanley arrives an hour late for work, yells at his boss, and then Charlie invites him out for Saturday night at the Coco Bongo. Here, though, Stanley's disheveled look and distressed manner makes a lot more sense. Getting questioned 3 times in 2 days by the cops when you know you're guilty, and you're also just trying to win over a girl you like, will make you look exactly like Stanley in this scene. It just didn't make as much sense before. Tina then walks into the bank and sets up her secret date with the mask. There's no scene after this with Ben Stein. The scene with Ben Stein ends with him not believing Stanley, so it's useless anyway. Instead, Stanley goes home after work and paces around, debating with himself whether or not to go as himself or the mask to his date with Tina. It then cuts to the movie scene where Stanley meets Tina as himself, and they strike up their conversation on the bench. The scene clearly shows Tina is interested in Stanley and maybe knows he's the mask, but prefers Stanley. She's clearly not happy when Stanley leaves and turns into the mask, and even runs away after kicking him. The scene with Ben Stein added nothing and didn't need to happen. Stanley was already at his wit's end, so the audience would totally buy him pacing back and forth in his apartment, debating with himself about what to do. From here, everything plays out exactly the same as in the movie, right up until Stanley takes off the mask after running from the hypnotized, dancing cops. Again, though, everything just has more impact here than it does in the film, because you really feel like Stanley is completely screwed, and the cops don't give a shit about Dorian. To be fair, though, they're mostly right at this point. So far, the only crime Dorian has committed is probably just firing his weapon inside his empty club. By this point, Stanley has probably committed enough crime to put himself away for life. This is completely fine, though, for our complete story, because in this story, our hero is learning a lesson. The next change we need to make is that Stanley doesn't take off the mask after running from the hypnotized cops. Instead, he uses the mask power to go find Tina. She's back at the benches having watched what happened to the cops, and there Stanley sits her down and takes off the mask. He starts explaining how it's ruining his life, and then she begins to tell him how she feels, but Dorian had her tailed and he catches the two. He's got his henchmen with him. With guns pointed at Stanley so he can't put the mask on, Dorian takes Tina and gets the mask from Stanley. The rest of the movie plays out exactly the same, but again, everything lands better now. Also, Act 3 starts when Dorian kidnaps Tina. This movie has a pretty long Act 2. Anyway, now Stanley getting arrested feels more justified, even if he was dumped on Kellaway's lap by Dorian with a fake mask. The cops have Stanley's prints from the bank heist, so they jail him. At the end of the movie, Doyle can comment to Kellaway that he guesses, hey, maybe Stanley's prints were at the bank because he works there. Kellaway can tell him to shut up or something. Now Stanley actually feels heroic when he breaks out of jail to defeat Dorian, instead of it feeling like he doesn't feel any guilt for anything he did and is only interested in getting Tina. The movie makes it seem like Stanley might not use his mask powers to stop Dorian if Tina wasn't involved, and that's kind of terrible writing. Now Tina, knowing Stanley is the mask a scene earlier than in the movie, makes it seem like she's doing a lot more in Act 3, even though nothing has changed. Just her knowing Stanley is the mask makes everything she does matter more. Her scene at the end of Act 2 where she visits Stanley in jail would only need a minor rewrite, I think just like cutting their first couple lines or something, but hits way harder now and gives Tina the chance to finish telling Stanley what she felt before Dorian found them. Although I said nothing else needed to change, there is one other thing, and that's the very ending. The mask clearly has a mind of its own, and it can exert to some extent. So after Tina throws it into the water and Charlie and Milo jump in after it, Charlie looks around, and Charlie should look around but doesn't see it, and neither does Milo. Charlie says, "Wait, where is it?" And Milo starts swimming back to shore. The scene ends the same as in the movie, with Stanley and Tina continuing their kiss, but as the music keeps playing, we cut to Stanley's apartment, and the camera moves to his bed where the mask suddenly appears from crackling green energy. Cut to black, roll credits. And now the autopsy. Sorry, I think there might be construction outside. So yeah, like I said, the mask is pretty good and doesn't need much fixing, but it still did not meet the requirements for a complete story. It needed some restructuring, and also it had a malignant character in Peggy. Not only is my fixed version funnier, it's got more drama, and it's also a few minutes shorter, plus it can set up any kind of sequel, maybe even a series, and no, not the cartoon one. It's crazy how much good removing Peggy does. If I were to suggest further improvements to this script, I would want to replace its villain and have a longer lead-up confrontation. I'd have Stanley learn more about using the mask and figuring out how it works before doing something like breaking into a bank. Also, setting up his powers in that way makes them more impactful later when he uses them. It's just more satisfying. I guess what I'm thinking of makes it sound a little more like Spider-Man, and I guess that's probably a good comparison. That's it though, I'm done fixing the mask, hope you enjoyed. Next video is probably going to be Princess Mononoke. The script is finished, it's just kinda long, so recording is a little more difficult. It is definitely not in as good a place as the mask. Until next time.